There are palaces in America that still command attention, mansions preserved behind velvet ropes, their names etched into guidebooks and school textbooks. And then there are palaces that vanish so completely that even memory seems unsure they ever existed. This is one of those places. A residence built by one of the most powerful men of the Gilded Age, a man whose decisions shape steel, labor, and capital across an entire nation, yet whose greatest architectural statement has quietly slipped out of the American story. This is the forgotten palace of Henry Clay Frick. At the height of his power, Frick was not simply rich. He was feared. As chairman of Carnegie Steel, he controlled the fuel that fed America's furnaces and the discipline that kept them running. Railroads depended on him. Cities grew because of him. Workers endured because of him. And like all men who believed their power was permanent, Frick expressed it in stone, marble, and space. He built not merely to live, but to declare his arrival among the untouchable elite. This palace was never meant to be charming. It was meant to endure. Its scale rivaled European estates, its materials imported at enormous cost, its rooms designed to host influence rather than warmth. Every corridor, every facade, every controlled entrance reflected a man who believed order was the highest virtue. In an era when wealth demanded spectacle, Frick's palace served as both sanctuary and signal, proof that he had secured a place above ordinary American life. Yet today, this palace is largely absent from public memory. Unlike the Vanderbilt mansions or the surviving Frick collection in New York, this residence does not benefit from postcards or preservation campaigns. Its disappearance is not an accident of time. It is a symptom of something deeper. America, a nation uncomfortable with aristocracy, chose to remember Frick the collector, the philanthropist, the institution builder, but not Frick the industrial monarch. The silence surrounding this palace tells us as much as its walls once did. It reveals how America negotiates its relationship with power after that power becomes embarrassing, controversial, or dangerous to celebrate. To understand why this palace was forgotten, we must first understand the man who built it, the system that elevated him, and the moment when that system began to collapse. Because this story is not only about architecture. It is about how nations decide which symbols of power deserve to survive, and which must quietly disappear. Henry Clay Frick did not inherit power. He constructed it methodically, patiently, and without sentiment, in a nation that rewarded men who could extract order from chaos. Born in 1849 in rural Pennsylvania, Frick came of age in an America still forming its industrial identity. This was not a world of old money or refined lineage. It was a world of furnaces, rail lines, and raw opportunity, where dominance belonged to those who understood production better than politics and discipline better than mercy. From the beginning, Frick showed little interest in spectacle. His ambition was quieter, colder, and ultimately far more dangerous. Frick's ascent began not with steel, but with coke, the fuel that powered steel production. In the hills of western Pennsylvania, he recognized what others overlooked: control the fuel, and you control the industry. While competitors chased expansion, Frick focused on efficiency, consolidation, and ruthless cost control. He built the largest coke empire in the country before he was 30, not by inventing new technology, but by eliminating waste, crushing rivals, and imposing strict authority over labor. His operations ran with military precision. Workers were irreplaceable. Output was sacred. His reputation brought Frick to the attention of Andrew Carnegie, whose steel empire required exactly what Frick supplied: reliable fuel and absolute control. Their partnership reshaped American industry. Carnegie was the public face, charming, philosophical, and celebrated as a symbol of self-made success. Frick was the enforcer. He managed operations, broke strikes, and ensured that production never slowed, regardless of human cost. Together, they built the most powerful industrial enterprise the world had ever seen. Frick's power did not come from innovation or charisma. It came from systems. He understood that modern wealth was no longer personal, it was structural. Railroads, mills, mines, and coke ovens formed the network that fed itself, growing stronger as competition disappeared. By the 1890s, Frick stood at the center of this machine, directing vast resources with a level of authority that rivaled governments. Entire towns depended on his decisions. Entire families survived or didn't based on the efficiency reports crossing his desk. Unlike many of his peers, Frick did not seek public affection. He avoided speeches, ignored popularity, and showed little interest in shaping his image. This detachment made him both feared and respected. To allies, he was dependable and relentless. To workers, he was invisible and absolute. He believed deeply in hierarchy and order, convinced that prosperity required obedience and that resistance was a flaw to be corrected, not a grievance to be addressed. Nowhere was this worldview more violently revealed than during the Homestead Strike of 1892, when steel workers organized against wage cuts. Frick responded not with negotiation but force. He locked out employees, surrounded the mill with barbed wire, and hired armed Pinkerton agents to reclaim control. The confrontation ended in bloodshed, leaving workers dead and the nation watching in horror. For Frick, the lesson was not regret, but confirmation. Authority, once challenged, had to be reinforced without hesitation. The aftermath hardened Frick permanently. Even after surviving an assassination attempt by an anarchist sympathizer, he refused to soften his stance. To him, labor unrest was not a social problem, it was a threat to order. This belief would shape not only his business decisions, but his private life, his architecture, and his relationship with the country. He helped industrialize Dot by the turn of the century. Frick's wealth was immense, but his position within the elite was uneasy. His partnership with Carnegie collapsed in bitterness, leaving Frick excluded from the myth-making that followed the sale of Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan. Carnegie became a symbol of philanthropy and progress. Frick became something more uncomfortable, a reminder of the cost at which industrial power had been secured. It was during this period that Frick turned increasingly to art, estates, and architecture. These were not hobbies. They were acts of stabilization. In a society beginning to question industrial excess, culture offered legitimacy. Collections softened reputations. Palaces suggested permanence. Frick's residences were not retreats from power. They were extensions of it. Controlled environments where hierarchy was preserved, distance was enforced, and influence could be exercised quietly. Yet even as Frick built, the world around him was changing. Progressive reformers challenged monopolies. Journalists exposed industrial brutality. The public mood shifted from admiration to suspicion. The very scale of men like Frick began to alarm the nation that had once celebrated them. Wealth without accountability no longer looked like success, it looked like threat. Frick sensed this shift instinctively. He did not attempt reinvention. He did not court forgiveness. Instead, he withdrew into spaces that reflected his values: order, separation, endurance. The palace that would later be forgotten was conceived in this atmosphere, not as a celebration, but as a fortress of legitimacy, a final assertion that his power, though challenged, was still absolute. To understand Henry Clay Frick is to understand the mechanics of American industrial dominance stripped of romance. He was not a hero, nor merely a villain. He was a product of a system that rewarded control above compassion and efficiency above humanity. His palace was not an indulgence. It was a statement. And as the nation moved on, eager to forget the men who ruled too visibly, that statement became something America preferred not to remember at all. Power in the Gilded Age was never content to exist quietly. It demanded to be seen, measured, and felt, not just in balance sheets and stock certificates, but in stone, iron, and land. For men like Henry Clay Frick, architecture was not decoration. It was proof. In a nation without hereditary titles or ancient castles, buildings became the only acceptable substitute for aristocracy. If power could not be inherited, it had to be constructed, and the larger and more permanent the structure, the more convincing the illusion of permanence became. By the late 19th century, America's industrial elite understood something instinctively: wealth that remained invisible was vulnerable. Fortunes built in mills and mines could evaporate with markets or legislation, but a palace changed the conversation. It transformed money into legacy. A mansion announced that its owner was no longer merely successful, but established someone whose presence reshaped geography itself. Streets bent around a stage. Neighborhoods formed in their shadow. Architecture allowed industrialists to occupy physical space with the same dominance they exercised economically. This was not accidental imitation of Europe. It was deliberate competition with it. The Gilded Age elite were acutely aware of how new their power was. European aristocracies had centuries of lineage embedded in castles, manors, and estates. American tycoons had decades. To bridge that gap, they built aggressively, importing architects, craftsmen, materials, and styles from across the Atlantic. Limestone from Indiana, marble from Italy, woodwork inspired by French chateaux and English country houses, all assembled at astonishing speed and cost. The message was unmistakable. American wealth was not temporary, and it no longer needed to apologize. For Frick, architecture carried an additional purpose. Unlike Vanderbilt or Rockefeller, he was not universally admired, nor did he seek to be. His power had been forged in labor conflict, consolidation, and discipline. He was respected by peers, but resented by the public. A palace offered something business never could distance. Walls separated him from scrutiny. Gates filtered access. Controlled interiors allowed influence to be exercised privately, away from crowds, newspapers, and protest. In this sense, architecture became insulation, both physical and moral. Every decision embedded in these structures reflected hierarchy. Grand entrances were designed not for convenience but for choreography. Guests moved through spaces that reminded them, subtly and constantly, who commanded the environment. Ceilings soared to dwarf the individual. Corridors guided movement deliberately. Private rooms remained unreachable, reinforcing the idea that access itself was a privilege granted, not a right. In these homes, power was not argued. It was assumed that the location of such palaces mattered as much as their design. They were rarely placed in chaotic urban centers unless dominance itself was the point. More often, they occupied elevated ground, secluded avenues, or landscaped estates that imposed order on nature. Frick understood this language well. Land was not just property. It was control made visible. A palace placed above its surroundings sent the same signal as a boardroom decision that dictated wages or output. It reminded everyone who saw it that hierarchy was natural, inevitable, and enforced. Architecture also functioned as social weaponry. Gilded Age society was fiercely competitive, and mansions became a silent scoreboard. Square footage, imported materials, number of rooms, and even the names of architects were carefully compared. To fall behind was to signal decline. To surpass rivals was to announce dominance without ever speaking it aloud. For Frick, whose relationship with Carnegie had collapsed and whose reputation had hardened, a palace offered a way to reassert his standing among equals without public confrontation. Yet these structures were not built solely for display. They were operational spaces. Meetings were held, alliances formed, disputes resolved within their walls. Business dinners doubled as negotiations. Art collections functioned as cultural capital, aligning industrial power with refinement and taste. The palace blurred the line between private residence and unofficial headquarters, allowing men like Frick to operate beyond the reach of public institutions. Decisions that shaped thousands of lives could be made beneath chandeliers rather than legislative ceilings. What made this architectural era unique was its urgency. These men built as if time itself were hostile. They sensed, even if only faintly, that their dominance might be questioned. Labor unrest, progressive politics, and investigative journalism were already eroding the unquestioned authority of industrial capital. A palace in this context was a race against doubt. The faster and more permanently it could be constructed, the more convincingly it could assert that the current order was unshakable. Frick's architectural choices reflected his personality more clearly than any memoir ever could. Where others embraced extravagance and ornament, Frick favored control, symmetry, and restraint within excess. His buildings were grand but rarely playful. They emphasized solidity over spectacle, stone over glass, endurance over charm. This was not a man building for admiration. It was a man building for survival, social, historical, and reputional. Yet embedded within these palaces was a quiet contradiction. The more they sought to project permanence, the more they revealed insecurity. True aristocracy does not need to announce itself. It simply exists. The Gilded Age elite, by contrast, built relentlessly because they knew their legitimacy rested on unstable ground. Their authority came from markets, not tradition. From ownership, not consent. Architecture was the attempt to freeze a moment of dominance before it could be challenged. As the 20th century approached, the meaning of these palaces began to shift. What once symbolized progress and success started to look like excess. What once inspired awe began to provoke resentment. The very scale that made these structures impressive also made them conspicuous targets for criticism. They stood as physical evidence of inequality in a nation increasingly uncomfortable with extremes. For Frick, this shift was deeply personal. His palace was conceived at the precise moment when industrial power was losing its moral certainty. It was built as the ground beneath men like him began to move. And while the structure itself may have been designed to endure, the system it represented was already entering its decline. In the end, Gilded Age architecture tells a story far larger than individual taste. It reveals how power attempts to make itself eternal, how wealth seeks legitimacy through stone, and how nations eventually decide which monuments deserve preservation and which are allowed to fade. Frick's forgotten palace was not merely a home. It was an argument, one that America ultimately chose not to accept. The life of Henry Clay Frick was one of contrasts, defined by both public spectacle and private calculation. In the narratives of the Gilded Age, his name is often mentioned alongside titans like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt. Yet the public understanding of his personal world, the world behind the walls of his palatial estates, remains fragmentary, almost mythic. Frick's residences, especially his lesser-known urban palaces, were more than homes. They were stages upon which he performed power, taste, and authority. To step inside one of these homes was to enter a carefully constructed narrative, where every architectural choice, every piece of imported furniture, and every art object had a purpose. The palace was both a fortress and a theater, designed to project permanence, control, and sophistication in equal measure. Unlike the ostentation of some of his contemporaries, Frick's architectural philosophy emphasized calculated grandeur. He sought to impress not with flamboyance, but with measured, enduring elegance. Every hallway, every ceiling, every column spoke of order and meticulous planning, an extension of the man himself. To understand Frick's palace is to understand a man who measured life in precision, whether negotiating a steel deal, confronting labor unrest, or curating his growing art collection. The palace itself was an intersection of European influence and American ambition. Frick, like many industrialists of his era, looked to the Old World for inspiration, importing architects, artisans, and craftsmen from France, Italy, and England. Marble for floors, intricate plasterwork for ceilings, and ironworks for gates all arrived from distant countries, chosen not only for their quality, but for the status they conveyed. The palace was a physical manifestation of a transatlantic aspiration. America was no longer a provincial outpost of the modern world. It was a home to new forms of power, capable of competing with centuries-old European dynasties. Yet, unlike the inherited nobility, Frick's social legitimacy was perpetually under construction. He could amass wealth, he could display taste, but acceptance into the upper echelons of society required constant negotiation. Each architectural decision was an argument for belonging, a silent message to peers and rivals alike. I am here, and my presence matters. Frick's lifestyle within the palace was equally strategic. The grand halls and drawing rooms were designed for both display and discretion. Guests were guided through spaces where social hierarchies were made clear through scale, positioning, and access. Certain rooms were intentionally restricted, accessible only to those who had proven their social worth. while more public areas served as stages for cultivated appearances. Entering the Frick Palace was to participate in a choreography of power, where seating arrangements, lighting, and even the arrangement of artwork reinforced the hierarchy that Frick meticulously curated. In this way, the palace became an instrument of social control. Every dinner, every gathering, every intimate conversation reinforced networks of influence that extended beyond mere friendship. These walls contained the negotiation of alliances and the subtle signaling of prestige, all while projecting an image of permanence and refinement to the broader public. Yet, the palace was not merely a private sphere. It was a monument to Frick's industrial identity. Its physical dominance mirrored his professional life, a life built upon steel, coal, and relentless efficiency. Frick's work in the steel industry had been ruthless, characterized by shrewd business tactics, fierce negotiation, and a willingness to act decisively against labor opposition. These traits translated directly into his domestic architecture. The fortress-like aspects of his homes, the high walls, controlled entrances, and expansive grounds were an extension of his approach to power. Command without question, order without compromise. Here, the physical and psychological intersected. Visitors felt the weight of authority in every step, from the moment they passed the iron gates to the final turn along marble corridors. In these halls, industrial strategy became spatial strategy, a manifestation of influence made tangible. Art was another critical component of Frick's palace, functioning simultaneously as cultural capital and personal expression. Unlike ostentation purely for show, Frick's collection reflected a studied understanding of European artistic achievement. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects were chosen not only for aesthetic value but for their ability to communicate erudition and taste. The palace became a curated museum as much as a residence, one that asserted Frick's position within a cultural continuum that stretched back centuries. Art, in this context, was not mere decoration. It was an argument. Wealth alone did not define sophistication. Knowledge and discernment did. Frick's careful acquisition strategy reinforced his authority, demonstrating that his influence extended beyond commerce into the realm of culture. The technological innovations embedded in the palace further emphasized Frick's modernity. Electricity, central heating, and early forms of climate control were integrated seamlessly, creating an environment that spoke to efficiency and foresight. These amenities were not luxuries alone. They were statements. They proclaimed that American innovation could rival European tradition, that the new wealth of industry could produce not only capital but comfort, order, and longevity. Every polished surface, every mechanical convenience, every hidden service corridor testified to a philosophy in which control extended to the minutiae of daily life. The palace, in short, was both symbol and system, a living, breathing representation of its owner's values. Yet for all its planning and foresight, the palace existed within a society increasingly skeptical of concentrated wealth. The Gilded Age, for all its glamour and achievement, was also a period of growing social tension. Labor unrest, populist agitation, and political scrutiny loomed outside Frick's gates. The grandeur of his residence could not entirely insulate him from public opinion. Indeed, it may have amplified scrutiny, transforming private opulence into a visible target. The palace, while a fortress, was also a mirror reflecting the contradictions of its era: immense wealth and deep inequality, achievement and moral controversy, power and fragility. Frick's architectural triumphs existed at the intersection of admiration and resentment, awe and critique, a tension that would only intensify as the 20th century progressed. The design of Frick's palace also reveals an intricate understanding of legacy. Unlike some contemporaries who built quickly and ostentatiously, Frick invested in permanence. Stonework, foundations, and structural engineering were intended to endure, projecting a sense of longevity that paralleled the industrial empires he had helped construct. The palace was, in effect, a temporal bridge, linking the present with the future, in which his name would remain associated with refinement, authority, and achievement. Yet, even as it sought to immortalize him, the palace was vulnerable to the forces that would eventually reshape American society. economic fluctuations, cultural shifts, and the democratization of wealth. The tension between ambition and impermanence imbued every corner of the estate with a quiet drama, a narrative of aspiration facing inevitable change. Frick's personal habits within the palace further illuminate his character. He moved deliberately, governed by routines that mirrored his approach to business. Meals were structured, correspondence meticulously managed, and leisure carefully circumscribed. Even the selection of company reflected a disciplined social strategy. Friends, family, and associates were invited not merely for camaraderie, but for the reinforcement of social networks and influence. In this way, domestic life became an extension of industrial life, a continuous exercise in order, control, and calculation. The palace for Frick was never neutral space. It was an active instrument of power, shaping interactions, reinforcing hierarchy, and preserving authority. As the 20th century approached, the palace began to assume a symbolic weight beyond its walls. It was a testament not only to Frick's achievements, but also to the broader story of American industrial ascendancy. In its stone and marble, its grand halls and private chambers, one could trace the contours of a society in transformation, a society negotiating the implications of unprecedented wealth, grappling with questions of legitimacy, and confronting the moral and social responsibilities of power. Frick's palace was a microcosm of this moment, embodying both the promise and the peril of concentrated influence in a democratic nation. Yet, despite its magnificence, the palace was not immune to the impermanence of human ambition. Frick's personal legacy, like the structure itself, would be subject to reinterpretation, neglect, and historical re-evaluation. Buildings, no matter how grand, are ultimately vessels reliant on memory and care to preserve their meaning. The palace, carefully curated and meticulously constructed, faced the same historical forces as the fortunes it symbolized: social change, shifting tastes, and the relentless march of time. Its story is inseparable from Frick's, a tale of ambition, strategy, and the complex interplay between wealth, culture, and power. The palace also illustrates the broader cultural anxiety of the Gilded Age elite. For men like Frick, wealth alone was never sufficient. It had to be validated, justified, and made tangible. Architecture became the ultimate medium for this expression, translating economic dominance into visible, permanent authority. Yet the very act of constructing such monuments revealed underlying insecurity. True aristocracy, built over centuries, requires no proclamation. For Frick, every corridor, every ceiling, every imported fixture was both declaration and defense, a simultaneous statement of achievement and armor against doubt. Finally, Frick's palace represents the intersection of personal vision and historical moment. It is a lens through which we can examine not only one man's ambitions but also the values, anxieties, and contradictions of an era. Within its walls, we see the Gilded Age distilled, a world of immense opportunity, ruthless competition, meticulous calculation, and a relentless pursuit of status. Every element, from structural engineering to decorative choices, tells a story of a society negotiating the boundaries of wealth, taste, and power. The palace was not merely a residence. It was a narrative, a performative assertion of identity, and a monument to the enduring human desire to leave a mark upon the world. Frick's palace, forgotten by many yet preserved in fragments of memory and archival documentation, continues to teach us about the Gilded Age, about the interplay between architecture and authority, and about the ways in which power attempts to inscribe itself into space. To study it is to witness the ambitions of a man who understood that influence extended beyond business, reaching into culture, society, and history itself. It is to understand that in the world of the industrial elite, a palace was never simply a home. It was a statement, a strategy, and a legacy all at once. The story of Henry Clay Frick's palace is not only one of architectural grandeur, but also of the relentless pursuit of control and influence, a reflection of the man who built it. By the time the palace reached its full realization, it had become a microcosm of Frick's worldview, meticulously ordered, subtly intimidating, and calculated to convey both permanence and power. Every aspect of the estate, from its iron gates to the tiniest decorative detail, was conceived as part of a larger narrative. It was an environment in which wealth was inseparable from authority, where cultural refinement was inseparable from strategic calculation, and where every interaction was carefully orchestrated to reinforce social hierarchy. Frick understood that the physical space around him was as much a tool of influence as his industrial ventures or social connections. The palace was a stage, and all who entered became part of a performance that communicated, with silent insistence, that Frick's presence was both dominant and unassailable. Within the walls of this remarkable residence, Frick's dual identities as industrial titan and cultural arbiter intersected seamlessly. He was a man who had amassed a fortune through steel and coal, whose methods were often described as ruthless, whose dealings with labor were marked by unflinching determination. Yet in his domestic world there was an equally determined cultivation of taste, elegance, and knowledge. The palace was both a private retreat and a public declaration. Artworks from the Renaissance and Baroque periods, imported from the great cultural centers of Europe, hung alongside intricate furnishings and ornate woodwork that spoke to a deep familiarity with the aesthetic standards of aristocracy. This was not mere decoration. It was a sophisticated form of communication. Each object, each placement, each carefully chosen artwork signaled Frick's understanding of cultural value, demonstrating that he was not merely wealthy but educated, discerning, and capable of participating in a social order traditionally reserved for the European elite. The spatial dynamics of the palace were no accident. Frick understood the subtle ways in which architecture could shape social interactions, convey authority, and control perception. The layout of the estate was deliberately hierarchical. Certain rooms and corridors were accessible only to trusted allies, while more public spaces were designed for controlled display. Visitors were guided through an experience that subtly reminded them of their relative status and the centrality of Frick's authority. The grand dining rooms, formal reception areas, and expansive galleries were stages upon which alliances could be negotiated, social hierarchies reinforced, and cultural literacy displayed. Private chambers, conversely, remained largely invisible, reinforcing the distinction between public performance and private control. In this way, the palace functioned as both home and instrument of power, shaping social dynamics as deliberately as Frick had shaped industry. Frick's attention to detail extended to the technological and structural aspects of the palace. Innovations such as electricity, advanced heating systems, and climate-controlled spaces were seamlessly integrated, providing both comfort and an unmistakable statement of modernity. Unlike many contemporaries who might flaunt luxury through ostentation alone, Frick embedded his wealth into practical, forward-looking solutions. The palace was a living testament to his belief that true power was exercised through foresight, planning, and mastery over both environment and resources. Even seemingly mundane features, the placement of staircases, the width of corridors, the lighting of galleries, were carefully considered, demonstrating the same meticulousness that defined his approach to business. In every sense, the palace was a manifestation of his philosophy, control, order, and strategic visibility. Yet for all its order and refinement, the palace was not isolated from the broader social tensions of the era. The Gilded Age was a period of stark contrasts. Immense wealth coexisted with widespread poverty, industrial innovation with labor unrest, and social ambition with increasing scrutiny of privilege. Frick's life as a business magnate had been marked by confrontation, most famously during the Homestead Strike of 1892, which left his reputation both powerful and polarizing. The palace, in its grandiosity, became a visible symbol of these contradictions. It embodied the security and authority he wielded, but it also drew attention to the inequalities and societal pressures that surrounded him. In a sense, the palace was both fortress and stage, a private sanctuary that nevertheless broadcast the tensions of wealth, class, and power to all who could see or hear of it. The role of art within the palace cannot be overstated. Frick's collection was among the most significant of its time, carefully curated to reflect not only personal taste but also social aspiration. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects were chosen for their historical importance, technical mastery, and the prestige they conferred. The collection communicated a narrative. Wealth alone did not confer status. It was the ability to understand, preserve, and display culture that truly marked one's place among society's elite. Frick's acquisitions were therefore deliberate, a strategic reinforcement of the palace's purpose as both home and instrument of influence. The art became part of a dialogue, speaking to visitors, peers, and posterity about the depth of his knowledge and the legitimacy of his cultural authority. Social life within the palace was governed by the same precision applied to architecture and art. Gatherings, dinners, and receptions were orchestrated to reinforce relationships, consolidate alliances, and project refinement. Seating arrangements, lighting, and the timing of events were carefully planned, ensuring that social hierarchies were observed and subtle messages communicated. Frick's guests, whether industrial associates, European dignitaries, or artists, were participants in an environment where appearances mattered as much as conversation. In this way, domestic life became a medium through which influence was exercised, social capital accrued, and power subtly reinforced. The palace itself, through its design and function, became a silent yet unyielding arbiter of status. The architectural influences of Europe were evident throughout the palace, reflecting Frick's deliberate engagement with old-world traditions. He drew inspiration from French chateaux, Italian villas, and English manors, importing craftsmen, materials, and design philosophies to ensure authenticity. Yet the palace was not a mere replica. It was a synthesis of European grandeur and American ambition. In this hybridized form, the palace asserted Frick's authority both culturally and socially. It demonstrated that American wealth, though newly acquired, could rival the sophistication of centuries-old aristocracy. This architectural dialogue between continents reflected the Gilded Age's broader aspirations, a desire to position the United States not only as an industrial powerhouse but as a center of culture, taste, and enduring influence. The grounds of the palace were equally expressive of Frick's vision. Expansive gardens, manicured lawns, and carefully positioned statues created an environment that extended the architectural narrative into nature. The interplay between landscape and structure emphasized order, control, and aesthetic harmony. Visitors moving through these outdoor spaces experienced a continuum of design, from the grandeur of the palace itself to the meticulously curated environment beyond its walls. The estate became a demonstration of the power to shape both built and natural worlds, reflecting Frick's broader approach to life, an integration of vision, discipline, and cultural authority that left little to chance. Despite its careful orchestration, the palace also revealed the fragility inherent in human ambition. The Gilded Age, while marked by extraordinary achievements, was also a period of social tension, political scrutiny, and evolving norms. Frick's prominence ensured that his private world was never fully insulated from public perception. The very elements that conveyed authority, wealth, cultural sophistication, and technological advancement also made the palace a symbol of inequality and excess, a visible target for critique and debate. In this sense, the palace encapsulated the contradictions of Frick's era. It was at once a triumph of ambition and a testament to the precariousness of social legitimacy, a reminder that power must constantly be negotiated, displayed, and defended. Moreover, the palace functioned as a repository of personal and familial legacy. Frick invested in its construction, decoration, and maintenance not solely for immediate prestige, but with an eye toward posterity. The estate was intended to endure, a tangible manifestation of both his wealth and his refined judgment, designed to communicate across generations. Every architectural detail, every curated piece of art, and every landscape vista was part of a narrative that sought to immortalize the Frick name. In this way, the palace transcended mere residential function, becoming a medium for the projection of identity, authority, and cultural legitimacy. It was a testament to the enduring human desire to be remembered, to leave an indelible mark upon both space and society at the same time. The palace's very grandeur revealed the tensions of the industrial elite's social position. Frick's wealth, while immense, did not automatically confer acceptance into the highest social circles. His estate was both declaration and defense, a visible assertion of achievement, intended to legitimize his presence among peers who prized lineage, heritage, and tradition. The palace's design, collections, and technological innovations were carefully calibrated to communicate belonging and refinement, while simultaneously asserting dominance. In this dual role, the residence became a complex instrument, balancing the projection of cultural sophistication with the demonstration of unassailable authority. Frick's palace also reflected the broader cultural currents of the Gilded Age, a period defined by the intersection of wealth, ambition, and social negotiation. Industrialists like Frick navigated a world in which power was measured not only by financial success but by cultural literacy, social influence, and the ability to shape perception. Architecture, art, and domestic management became tools of persuasion, signaling status and authority to both peers and the wider public. Frick's palace, in its careful orchestration, embodied this reality. It demonstrated that mastery over physical space, taste, and social ritual could extend the reach of industrial influence into realms traditionally reserved for inherited privilege. The integration of art, architecture, and social strategy created a residence that was far more than a home. It was a dynamic environment in which every element, from layout to lighting to collection, was designed to communicate, persuade, and reinforce. Guests entering the palace participated in a performance of wealth, taste, and influence that left little to chance. In this way, the estate functioned as a living extension of Frick himself, precise, strategic, cultured, and unwavering in its assertion of authority. It was a place where the boundaries between domestic life, cultural projection, and social power blurred, creating an environment that was as intellectually and emotionally imposing as it was materially impressive. Frick's attention to detail extended even to the minutiae of daily operation. Staff, servants, and household management were organized with the same precision applied to architecture and art. Every routine, every protocol, every interaction was guided by efficiency and hierarchy, reflecting Frick's belief that control extended to all aspects of life. The palace thus became a microcosm of industrial order, a space where authority was exercised at every level, from grand receptions to private correspondence. This comprehensive approach reinforced the palace's dual role as both home and instrument of influence, demonstrating the extent to which Frick's worldview was embedded into physical and social structures alike. As the decades passed, the palace endured both acclaim and critique. It stood as a monument to a man who had shaped industry, culture, and society. Yet it also became emblematic of the inequalities and excesses of the Gilded Age. The grandeur that impressed visitors and peers also provoked scrutiny and reflection, raising questions about wealth, social responsibility, and the consolidation of power. In this tension, the palace's story mirrors the broader narrative of America's industrial elite. Extraordinary achievement intertwined with moral ambiguity, cultural aspiration paired with social vulnerability. It is in this interplay that the estate's historical significance becomes clear. It is not only a record of individual ambition, but a lens through which to understand an entire era. In the final analysis, Frick's palace exemplifies the deliberate intertwining of wealth, culture, and power. It was not merely a home but a statement, a performance, and a strategy, crafted with meticulous attention to both aesthetic and social detail. Every aspect, from its imported materials to its curated art collection, from its technological innovations to its social choreography, was designed to communicate authority, permanence, and refinement. The palace embodied Frick's understanding that influence was multidimensional, encompassing both economic might and cultural legitimacy, and that architecture could serve as a powerful instrument in achieving and projecting that influence. Frick's vision extended beyond personal gain. It was a calculated engagement with history, society, and posterity. By constructing a residence that combined architectural mastery, cultural sophistication, and strategic social design, he sought to secure not only his immediate prestige but his enduring legacy. The palace became a tangible manifestation of ambition, taste, and authority, a space in which personal identity and historical narrative converged. Its story is a testament to the complexities of the Gilded Age, a period in which wealth, culture, and power were inseparable, and in which architecture served as both stage and instrument in the performance of elite identity. Ultimately, Frick's palace remains a symbol of the intricate relationship between human ambition and material expression. It illustrates how space, art, and social strategy can be harnessed to create an environment that is both imposing and enduring, reflective of a man who understood that influence extended far beyond financial accumulation. In its walls, in its halls, and in its carefully curated contents, we find a narrative that speaks to the ambitions, anxieties, and aspirations of an era defined by the pursuit of wealth, taste, and lasting authority. The palace is a monument not only to Henry Clay Frick but to the cultural and social ambitions of the Gilded Age itself, preserving a story of power, control, and legacy that continues to resonate across time. Henry Clay Frick's palace, while celebrated for its architectural magnificence and cultural sophistication, also stands as a reflection of the broader societal contradictions of the Gilded Age, a period when immense wealth existed alongside crushing inequality, and when the achievements of industrial titans were shadowed by social unrest and moral scrutiny. By the time Frick's estate reached its full grandeur, it had become more than a residence. It was a fortress of identity, a carefully orchestrated environment that simultaneously projected authority, taste, and permanence while shielding its owner from the turbulence of the outside world. Every element of the palace, its imported marble, hand-carved woodwork, and Renaissance-inspired art was not merely a display of wealth but a calculated statement, a physical manifestation of Frick's understanding that in the Gilded Age, perception was power. The estate was a stage upon which both private ambitions and public reputations could be enacted, a space designed to impress, intimidate, and control, reflecting the meticulousness and exacting standards that defined Frick's life in industry and society. Within the palace, Frick's identity as a titan of steel and coal merged seamlessly with his cultivated persona as a patron of the arts. The collection of paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects imported from Europe was curated not simply for personal enjoyment but as a visual language, communicating knowledge, discernment, and social legitimacy. Each object was a statement, selected for its historical significance, technical mastery, or aesthetic prestige. To Frick, the collection was more than decoration. It was an instrument for asserting authority in a society that valued not only wealth but the ability to demonstrate cultural literacy. Visitors were immersed in this carefully constructed narrative. Entering the palace was entering a world in which social hierarchies were visually and spatially reinforced, where refinement and power were inseparable, and where Frick's taste acted as both shield and sword, signaling to peers and potential rivals alike that he was a man who commanded both industry and intellect. The palace's architecture further reinforced Frick's influence. European design motifs, from French chateaus to Italian palazzi, were adapted and integrated into a distinctly American vision of grandeur, resulting in a hybridized space that communicated both sophistication and ambition. The spatial dynamics of the estate were deliberate. Formal reception areas displayed wealth and culture to visiting dignitaries, allies, and social elites, while private chambers remained secluded, preserving the hierarchy between public impression and personal life. Even the smallest details, the width of a corridor, the positioning of a staircase, the lighting of a gallery, were meticulously considered to influence perception, guide movement, and reinforce authority. In this way, the palace became both a sanctuary and a stage, simultaneously concealing vulnerability while amplifying power, an architectural embodiment of Frick's philosophy that control over space was control over status and influence. Beyond its walls, the estate's expansive grounds extended this narrative of control and refinement. Manicured gardens, ornamental fountains, and carefully positioned sculptures created a landscape that complemented and reinforced the architectural message of order and permanence. The integration of nature and design reflected Frick's belief in the projection of mastery over both built and natural environments. Visitors traversing these outdoor spaces were guided through a curated experience, one in which every vista, path, and floral arrangement reinforced the sense of Frick's omnipresent authority. In this environment, the boundaries between domesticity, display, and social influence blurred, revealing a deliberate strategy to merge private wealth with public performance, creating an enduring impression that was both awe-inspiring and subtly coercive. The technological innovations incorporated into the palace further distinguished it from contemporaneous estates. Electricity, advanced heating systems, and climate-controlled rooms were seamlessly integrated, providing not only comfort but a clear signal of modernity and foresight. Unlike many Gilded Age elites who displayed luxury through ostentation alone, Frick embedded his wealth into practical, forward-thinking solutions. The palace became a living demonstration of his belief that true power was exercised through control, planning, and the mastery of both environment and resources. Even seemingly mundane features, the efficiency of service corridors, the strategic placement of servants' quarters, and the thoughtful layout of kitchens and storage, were calculated to support a broader vision of order and operational supremacy. Reflecting the same precision that had characterized Frick's industrial ventures, social life within the palace operated under these same principles of careful orchestration. Dinners, receptions, and private gatherings were staged to reinforce alliances, display refinement, and assert dominance. Seating arrangements, the timing of events, and the order of introductions were all meticulously managed, ensuring that social hierarchies were observed and that Frick's guests understood their place within his carefully curated social order. Artists, diplomats, industrial associates, and European nobility were all participants in this structured performance, entering a space where aesthetics, etiquette, and architecture converged to communicate both subtle and overt messages about authority and legitimacy. Through this interplay of design, art, and social choreography, the palace itself became a medium for influence, extending Frick's power beyond the industrial realm into culture and society. Frick's careful curation of art within the palace served as both personal passion and strategic tool. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects were selected not only for their beauty, but for their capacity to convey prestige, knowledge, and taste. Historical significance, artistic mastery, and rarity were all considerations in the construction of the collection, reinforcing the narrative that Frick was not merely wealthy but intellectually and culturally sophisticated. In doing so, he elevated the role of the palace from mere residence to instrument of social negotiation and cultural authority. Visitors were presented not with mere opulence, but with a carefully articulated statement that Frick's vision, discernment, and accomplishments could rival those of established European aristocracy, asserting that American industrial success had produced not only economic power but cultural legitimacy as well. The palace also functioned as a protective barrier against the social scrutiny and tensions that marked the Gilded Age. Frick's industrial career had been defined by confrontation, most notably during the Homestead Strike of 1892, where labor unrest and violent conflict drew national attention to his uncompromising methods. Within the walls of the estate, Frick could exercise control over both environment and perception, shielding himself from criticism while simultaneously projecting an image of stability, refinement, and authority. The juxtaposition of private sanctuary and public display underscored the complex social calculus of the era. Wealth alone did not guarantee acceptance or respect, but the mastery of space, art, and social ritual could extend influence and assert legitimacy even in a society attentive to moral and economic scrutiny. Moreover, the palace embodied the ambitions of legacy. Frick's investments in architecture, art, and landscaping were designed not merely to impress contemporaries but to endure across generations. Every detail from imported materials to curated collections served to communicate permanence, taste and authority, signaling to posterity the magnitude of Frick's achievements. The estate was intended to be a lasting testament, a physical embodiment of identity and accomplishment, reflecting a vision that extended beyond immediate prestige to historical recognition. Through its design, collection, and social function, the palace became both a personal monument and a cultural artifact, preserving a narrative of influence, ambition, and refinement that would outlive its creator. The juxtaposition of technological sophistication and cultural elegance within the palace also highlighted the Gilded Age tension between progress and tradition. Frick integrated modern conveniences, advanced engineering, and structural innovations into a setting steeped in classical European design. This combination created a unique environment that asserted both contemporary relevance and historical awareness, signaling that Frick's wealth was not only material but intellectual and cultural. The palace thus functioned as an interface between eras. It was forward-looking in its technology, grounded in its aesthetic references, and strategically positioned to project an image of timeless authority. This deliberate blending of old and new mirrored the broader ambitions of America's industrial elite, who sought to establish legitimacy through a synthesis of wealth, taste, and technological progress. The palace's intricate choreography of space, art, and social dynamics extended into everyday operations. Staff organization, household management, and service routines were conducted with military-like precision, reflecting Frick's belief that authority should permeate every aspect of life. Servants' movements, schedules, and interactions were meticulously planned to maintain efficiency, hierarchy, and order, demonstrating that control was exercised not only in public displays but also behind the scenes. The residence became a microcosm of industrial organization, a space in which discipline, structure, and hierarchy reinforced both functional operations and social signaling. In this way, Frick's approach to domestic management mirrored his business philosophy: meticulous planning, strategic control, and absolute oversight ensured that every element served a purpose in the projection of influence. The cultural and social narratives embedded within the palace extended beyond personal ambition to reflect the broader societal dynamics of the Gilded Age. Wealth, while necessary, was insufficient for social ascension. Legitimacy required cultural literacy, strategic alliances, and careful orchestration of public perception. Frick's residence exemplified these dynamics, demonstrating how architecture, art, and domestic management could be harnessed to convey status and influence. Through this integration, the palace became a tool of social negotiation, allowing Frick to navigate the delicate balance between wealth, culture, and authority, asserting his place among America's elite while simultaneously shaping the perception of his peers and posterity. At its core, Frick's palace was an exercise in power, both visible and subtle. It communicated dominance through scale, sophistication, and curation, while also regulating social interaction through spatial hierarchy and ritualized hospitality. Every element, from the grand halls to private corridors, from imported art to landscaped gardens, was designed to assert control, convey refinement, and maintain social order. The residence was more than a home. It was a carefully managed environment that merged personal identity, cultural authority, and social influence, reflecting a philosophy in which architecture and domestic design were inseparable from power and legacy. The palace also served as a reminder of the fragility inherent in even the most meticulously constructed domains. While it projected authority and permanence, it could not entirely shield Frick from the scrutiny, critique, and shifting social dynamics of the Gilded Age. The very elements that conveyed refinement, wealth, cultural sophistication, and technological innovation also invited reflection on inequality, excess, and the social costs of industrial dominance. In this tension, the estate exemplified the paradox of elite ambition, the desire for enduring legacy and recognition, set against the reality of societal judgment and historical contingency. Frick's palace ultimately endures as a testament to the complex interplay of wealth, culture, and power during the Gilded Age. It demonstrates how architecture, art, and social strategy can be orchestrated to project authority, establish legitimacy, and create an environment in which influence extends far beyond financial success. Every element from spatial design to curated art collections, from technological innovation to choreographed social interactions, serve to communicate both capability and intent, constructing a narrative of dominance, refinement, and permanence. In its legacy, the palace encapsulates the ambitions and anxieties of a transformative era in American history. It stands as both a personal monument to Henry Clay Frick and a cultural artifact of a time when wealth, taste, and influence converged to shape society's perceptions of power. Through its walls, gardens, and halls, the estate tells a story not only of one man's vision but of the broader dynamics of social authority, cultural legitimacy, and enduring human ambition, preserving a narrative that continues to resonate as a symbol of the Gilded Age's complex and enduring legacy. The Forgotten Palace of Henry Clay Frick, while a testament to industrial ambition and aesthetic discernment, was never merely a static monument. It was a stage upon which the complex interplay of personal vision, societal expectation, and cultural diplomacy unfolded with deliberate precision. By the time Frick's estate had taken shape, the mansion had already become a repository not only of art but of identity, an architectural autobiography that communicated to visitors the narrative of a man who had risen from modest beginnings to command one of the most formidable industrial empires in American history. The palace's walls held more than decorative splendor. They contained the story of a self-fashioned authority, a meticulously curated persona that bridged the worlds of steel, coal, and high culture. Every entryway, gallery, and private chamber was more than a passage or room. It was a carefully orchestrated experience designed to assert mastery over both material and social landscapes, to project control, refinement, and an understanding of culture that few of Frick's contemporaries could rival. From the moment one approached the estate, the architecture itself communicated a narrative of sophistication and permanence. Influences drawn from French chateaux, Italian palazzi, and English country estates were not applied haphazardly. Each stylistic choice was a deliberate effort to situate Frick within a transatlantic dialogue of taste and authority. The grand facades, soaring ceilings, and intricate stonework conveyed permanence and stability, signaling to visitors that the man behind these walls was both a product of the modern industrial age and a student of history and culture. Pathways, gardens, and exterior vistas were orchestrated to heighten the sense of procession and discovery, leading guests along choreographed routes that reinforced hierarchy, anticipation, and awe. Even in the exterior landscaping, Frick's eye for order and aesthetic harmony demonstrated the same methodical sensibilities that had guided his industrial ventures, translating efficiency and vision into the language of beauty and power. Within the interior, the palace functioned as both gallery and theater, each room carefully arranged to communicate a narrative of taste and erudition. Frick's collection of European masterpieces, including works by Rembrandt, Reynolds, and Gainsborough, was not simply for admiration but for instruction. Visitors were guided through a visual curriculum that reinforced ideals of culture, refinement, and historical continuity. The selection, placement, and lighting of each piece were deliberate, creating a sense of intellectual and aesthetic coherence that transformed the house into a living lesson on authority and discernment. Decorative arts, sculptures, and tapestries were integrated into this narrative, each object a deliberate cue that reinforced Frick's cultivated persona. Through these orchestrated visual experiences, the palace became an instrument of social influence, where the visitor's journey through space mirrored an induction into Frick's vision of cultural hierarchy and sophistication. Frick's role as a host further reinforced the strategic function of the palace. Entertaining was a carefully curated performance in which social protocols, seating arrangements, and conversational dynamics were meticulously managed. Guests, whether they were diplomats, fellow industrialists, or European aristocrats, encountered a space that simultaneously impressed and disciplined. where every interaction underscored the host's authority and taste. These social rituals were not casual. They were extensions of Frick's control over environment and perception, demonstrating that influence could be enacted not only through wealth but through the choreography of social experience. The palace, in this sense, was both a physical and performative tool, designed to cultivate respect, admiration, and deference among those who entered its halls. The integration of modern technology further reinforced the palace's dual role as sanctuary and stage. Electricity, heating systems, and early climate control were embedded seamlessly within the structure, enhancing comfort while signaling sophistication and progress. Frick's industrial sensibilities were thus reflected in the domestic sphere. The estate was a demonstration of how practical innovation could coexist with luxury and aesthetic refinement. Service corridors, kitchens, and staff quarters were similarly designed with efficiency in mind, allowing the visible grandeur to exist without the chaos of labor, subtly reinforcing the illusion of effortless control. In these design choices, the palace became a microcosm of Frick's broader worldview, where order, foresight, and authority governed both industry and domestic life. The social and cultural function of the palace extended beyond mere display. It was a vehicle for asserting legitimacy and shaping perception in an era of intense scrutiny and public attention. Frick's industrial career had been marked by controversy, including labor unrest and public criticism, most famously during the Homestead Strike of 1892. Within the palace, however, he could exert absolute control over the narrative, presenting an image of refinement, stability, and authority that countered the turbulence of his public life. This duality, private sanctuary and public theater, exemplified the sophisticated strategy behind Gilded Age elite power, where social influence was constructed as much through controlled environments as through financial might. The mansion, therefore, became a symbol of strategic authority, mediating the tension between personal ambition, public scrutiny, and cultural aspiration. Artistic patronage and collection were central to this strategy. Frick's acquisitions were selected not only for their aesthetic value, but for their ability to communicate erudition, discernment, and historical awareness. By collecting European masterpieces and commissioning works that reflected both classical and contemporary sensibilities, Frick positioned himself as a bridge between old-world culture and new-world ambition. The palace, as a repository of these works, functioned as a tangible assertion of intellectual and cultural capital, demonstrating that influence extended beyond the factory floor into realms of taste, judgment, and moral authority. Visitors encountered not just a home, but a curated narrative, where art and architecture were instruments in the construction of identity and the projection of social hierarchy. The palace's design also reflected subtle negotiations of privacy and public exposure. Grand halls and reception rooms facilitated visibility, showcasing Frick's taste and authority to visitors, while private chambers and secluded corridors offered spaces for intimate reflection, family life, and confidential business. This careful balance ensured that the mansion could serve multiple functions: a stage for performance, a fortress for control, and a sanctuary for retreat. The interplay between openness and seclusion mirrored the complexities of Frick's own life, negotiating visibility, influence, and discretion with equal precision. Even in the layout of doorways, windows, and corridors, the architecture communicated hierarchy, guiding visitors through experiences that reinforced perception while maintaining the owner's dominion over movement and engagement. Landscape design further amplified these dynamics. Gardens, fountains, and sculpture were orchestrated to complement interior spaces, extending the narrative of control, taste, and aesthetic refinement beyond the walls of the mansion. Walkways were carefully aligned to create dramatic sightlines, orchestrated moments of surprise, and curated experiences that guided perception. The grounds themselves were a demonstration of authority over nature, a performative extension of the domestic environment that reinforced Frick's mastery over both material and symbolic realms. Visitors moving through the estate encountered a controlled continuum of beauty, where architecture, art, and landscape worked in concert to communicate power and refinement. Education and cultural literacy were embedded in the experience of the palace. Staff, guests, and visitors were participants in a carefully choreographed environment where etiquette, taste, and hierarchy were communicated through both direct instruction and subtle suggestion. The mansion operated as a medium of influence, transmitting values, norms, and expectations to those within its sphere. By orchestrating both visual and social experiences, Frick leveraged architecture and art as tools of cultural authority, demonstrating that power in the Gilded Age was exercised not only through industry but through perception, aesthetic judgment, and social strategy. The palace also reflected broader societal tensions of the era. The disparity between Frick's immense wealth and the labor struggles that had characterized his industrial ventures underscored the contradictions inherent in the Gilded Age elite. Within the walls of the estate, these tensions were mediated through art, architecture, and social performance, projecting an image of order, control, and sophistication even as the broader world wrestled with inequality and social unrest. The mansion, therefore, was both a personal monument and a cultural instrument, negotiating the contradictions of wealth, power, and legitimacy in a highly scrutinized society. Through its integration of architecture, art, landscape, and social performance, the palace embodied Frick's understanding of elite influence as a multidimensional exercise. Every corridor, gallery, and vista was a calculated statement of taste, authority, and control, demonstrating the convergence of wealth, intellect, and cultural literacy. The mansion was more than a home. It was a meticulously orchestrated arena in which the Gilded Age elite could assert identity, project influence, and negotiate the complex intersections of power, culture, and legacy. In this sense, Frick's estate was not simply a residence, but a living testament to the strategies, ambitions, and contradictions of America's industrial aristocracy, preserving a story of vision, refinement, and authority that resonates across generations. In the years after Henry Clay Frick's death, his palace, once a testament to industrial might, cultural refinement, and personal authority, began a different kind of journey, one that ensured its fading from memory was as deliberate and telling as its creation had been spectacular. This was not simply the story of a house falling into disrepair or being repurposed by new owners, as has happened with many historic estates. Frick's palace became a site of architectural amnesia, a monument quietly erased not by accident, but by the shifting currents of American identity, public sentiment, and cultural priorities. To understand why this palace was allowed, or perhaps encouraged, to disappear from the collective consciousness, we must first recognize that it embodied a paradox. It was too grand to be ignored, yet too politically and socially loaded to be preserved without reinterpretation. It was an undeniable display of wealth at a time when America increasingly recoiled from such unvarnished demonstrations of power. And so the palace, once designed to cement permanence, became a casualty of the very cultural forces that had first inspired its construction. Frick's residence did not vanish because it was architecturally insignificant, far from it. Its design drew on the highest traditions of European palaces. Its materials were imported and curated with the same precision that Frick demanded in his boardrooms. It was a building that could have stood beside any grand European chateau and not appeared out of place. Yet, in the shifting moral landscape of 20th century America, such displays of concentrated wealth became uncomfortable reminders of excess, inequality, and unregulated industrial power. What had once been perceived by elite circles as a legitimate claim to cultural authority began to look like a relic of arrogance. In a society increasingly proud of egalitarian values and suspicious of inherited privilege, Frick's palace became an awkward historical footprint, one that was easier to forget than celebrate. The story of the palace's fading begins in the years immediately after Frick's passing. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, who saw their homes preserved as public institutions, libraries, or museums, Frick's estate did not receive a clear institutional champion. His heirs, while wealthy, were not as invested in maintaining the residence as a cultural site. Perhaps because the identity they inherited was complex and contested. Frick's legacy was not a simple one to revere without qualification. He was celebrated in certain circles as a builder of industry, yet remembered in others as a symbol of labor conflict and unyielding authority. His association with the violent suppression of labor at Homestead cast a long shadow. To preserve his palace without critical framing risked glorifying a past that Americans were increasingly uncomfortable idealizing. Public sentiment in the early to mid-20th century was not inclined toward straightforward celebration of industrial titans. The Great Depression had already shifted attitudes toward concentrated wealth. Political and cultural movements emphasized fairness, social welfare, and skepticism of unchecked capitalism. In this environment, historic preservation did not automatically extend to the homes of industrial barons, whose reputations were complicated by public strife and moral ambiguity. Whereas European aristocratic estates survived as reminders of dynastic heritage, anchored by centuries of tradition, consolidated identity, and cultural myth-making, American industrial palaces lacked that generational narrative and entrenched acceptance. They were new American-made assertions of power, and American society was beginning to redefine itself in opposition to unfettered authority. As the 20th century progressed, the notion of preserving the palace became increasingly entangled with questions of morality rather than aesthetics. Should the residence of a man whose life was as controversial as it was impressive be enshrined as a cultural landmark? Could the state or a museum ethically promote a site that symbolized both remarkable cultural achievement and a period of intense social conflict? These were not abstract questions. They were the debates that shaped preservation policies and cultural priorities throughout the century. Frick's palace became a test case, not for architectural value, but for the moral calculus of what deserved remembrance. Simultaneously, urban development and changing real estate priorities began to encroach on the physical space surrounding the estate. The neighborhoods that once housed America's elite shifted in economic function, demographic composition, and architectural value. What had once been a bastion of Gilded Age dominance became more integrated into the evolving cityscape. The palace, while still grand, was no longer insulated by separation from ordinary life. Its presence became an anomaly, a reminder of a social order that larger forces were systematically dismantling. In this context, the palace was not only socially uncomfortable, it was increasingly logistically vulnerable. During this period, the cultural machinery that keeps historic buildings alive, public funding, preservation societies, academic advocacy, was more enthusiastically aligned with sites that could be celebrated without controversy. Colonial heritage, revolutionary landmarks, and sites of democratic struggle gained prominence. The impulse to preserve was increasingly tied to narratives of shared democratic identity rather than reminders of class dominance. In this shifting cultural hierarchy, Frick's palace sat uneasily. It was magnificent, yes, but it was also a monument to hierarchical power at a time when the national narrative was moving toward inclusion, equality, and shared memory. To preserve the palace uncritically risked endorsing the very inequalities that modern America was trying to reconcile. The absence of a clear champion for the palace's preservation sealed its fate. Unlike estates that were transformed into museums with mission statements justifying their historical value, Frick's residence lacked an institutional narrative that could transcend its association with wealth. The Frick Collection in New York, for example, became a celebrated cultural institution precisely because it was recontextualized as a center for public art appreciation. Distanced from its founder's industrial persona, the palace, however, never found a similarly compelling reframe. Without a contextual mission that could guide public understanding, one that acknowledged both its cultural value and its moral complexity, the estate remained a contested symbol. And contested symbols are rarely saved without broad consensus. As the decades passed, the palace's absence from textbooks, public tours, and preservation lists contributed to a growing cultural obscurity. New generations learned about Frick, if at all, through the lens of museums and art philanthropy, not through the architectural monument that once embodied his personal ambition. In this slow process of forgetting, the palace became a historical ghost, acknowledged by scholars, documented in archives, but absent from public consciousness. Its erasure was not violent. It was bureaucratic. It was the result of a society choosing not to make space for symbols it no longer understood how to integrate into its evolving collective story. This absence tells us something profound about how nations remember and how they choose to forget. Memory is a cultural choice. Forgetting is an act of definition. The erasure of Frick's palace was not merely a loss of structure. It was a decision by society about what kind of past it wanted to claim and which representations of power were too discordant with its self-image to preserve without critical transformation. The palace became not a relic of progress, but a relic of a moment America preferred to reinterpret rather than uphold. In many ways, the palace's disappearance stands in contrast to a broader movement that has preserved other Gilded Age estates, converting them into houses that tell inclusive stories of society's evolution. The decision to forget Frick's palace, whether by neglect, by lack of institutional support, or by cultural consensus, reflects the complex dialogue between memory, morality, and identity that shapes historical preservation. America chose not to canonize it as heritage, not because it lacked beauty or craftsmanship, but because it represented something about power that the nation was increasingly unwilling to enshrine without qualification. Today, what remains of Henry Clay Frick's palace exists largely in archives, photographs, and the lingering narratives of architectural scholars. Its physical absence echoes the larger disappearance of unquestioned industrial dominance from America's cultural landscape. The palace was not demolished by force. It was outgrown by time, reframed by morality, and ultimately overshadowed by the nation's evolving sense of itself. In its quiet erasure, we see not only the fading of a building but the transformation of American cultural memory, a shift away from monuments of concentrated power toward narratives that embrace broader participation in defining history. Frick's palace, forgotten though it may be, remains a powerful symbol precisely because it is no longer visible. Its disappearance invites us to ask difficult questions about how we choose to remember our past, whose stories we elevate and whose symbols we allow to fade. In this silence, the palace speaks not of permanence, but of the impermanence of power, a reminder that in a democracy, even the most imposing monuments can be forgotten when the collective story moves in a different direction. The silence where Henry Clay Frick's palace once stood is not simply the absence of brick and stone. It is the echo of a larger transformation in American identity, a quiet testament to the nation's ability to outgrow not only its monuments but the very ideals those monuments once proclaimed. The forgotten palace serves as a metaphor for how America negotiates its past, not by erasing it in violence, nor by preserving every remnant of grandeur, but by reassessing what stories deserve enduring visibility and which are permitted to slip into obscurity. What remains in the shadow of the vanished palace is a narrative not only about a man and his ambitions, but about the evolving values of a society that once celebrated immense wealth as evidence of success and now questions it as a symbol of inequality. In contemplating the silence left behind, we confront not merely the disappearance of a building, but the deliberate shaping of historical memory, the choices a nation makes about what it chooses to honor, what it chooses to interrogate, and what it chooses to let go. Henry Clay Frick's palace was an imprint of his worldview, ordered, imposing, and designed to project permanence. Yet America itself was never designed for permanence in the old world sense. It was founded on ideas, not bloodlines, and bound by a faith in progress rather than tradition. The Gilded Age was a momentary alignment of industrial accumulation and cultural aspiration, a time when the nation flirted with the trappings of aristocracy without ever granting it legitimacy. Frick's palace embodied that flirtation at its most ornate, a residence that sought to bridge raw economic power with cultural refinement. But its eventual disappearance reveals something fundamental. In the long arc of American history, No edifice of individual dominance is destined to outlast the collective narrative forever. To understand this, we must first recognize how deeply architecture can serve as both symbol and argument. Frick's estate was not only a home. It was a claim that industrial success conferred cultural authority, that wealth could legitimize taste, that power could be codified in marble and oak. In an age where industrial magnates exerted influence far beyond their factory floors, architecture became a language through which they spoke not only to peers but to posterity. The scale of the building, the sources of its materials, the pedigree of its artwork, every choice was a deliberate public statement. But when the underlying assumptions of that statement began to shift, the physical structure lost the framework that once sustained its meaning. The 20th century brought waves of social, political, and cultural upheaval that steadily eroded the foundations upon which Frick's palace was constructed, not in stone, but in ideology. The Progressive Era, the Great Depression, populist critiques of concentrated wealth, and later movements for civil rights and economic fairness reframed how Americans thought about equity, power, and historical celebration. Monuments that embodied concentrated authority without shared consent became discomforting or obsolete. The palace was a relic of a moment when wealth was admired almost uncritically. But as the nation re-evaluated that admiration, the very qualities that once demanded preservation now invited critique. At the heart of this shift was a transformation in the American conception of legitimacy. In the Gilded Age, industrial success was often equated with individual virtue, the belief that accumulation was evidence of talent, discipline, and genius. Frick's empire was built on those principles, and his palace was the architectural punctuation mark on a life defined by relentless consolidation. Yet as labor movements gained strength, as public discourse increasingly recognized the human cost of industrial expansion, and as academic and journalistic narratives challenged the moral clean line between success and exploitation, the narrative foundation of industrial aristocracy eroded. The palace, once a symbol of unassailable authority, became a relic lacking the ideological scaffolding that once supported it. In this context, the palace's disappearance was not only a physical phenomenon but a cultural reckoning. America did not need bulldozers to erase the palace. It needed only a shift in collective consciousness, a recalibration of what constitutes worthiness of remembrance. Frick himself became an ambiguous figure in public memory, admired in some circles for his patronage of the arts, criticized in others for his role in labor conflict and ruthless business practices. His palace, bound up with both strands of his identity, resisted uncomplicated commemoration. What was once intended as a monument to permanence became, by mid-century, an uncomfortable reminder of a chapter in history that the nation was beginning to question rather than celebrate. This process, while seemingly a negation, is in fact a form of historical engagement. Nations do not remember everything equally. They curate memory according to prevailing values and emerging understandings of justice. The disappearance of Frick's palace is instructive because it reveals this curatorial process in action. The palace was not forgotten because it lacked beauty or craftsmanship. It was forgotten because its meaning no longer harmonized with the evolving American narrative, a narrative increasingly centered on equality, democratic participation, and skepticism of concentrated private power. To preserve the palace uncritically would have been to enshrine a symbol whose foundational legitimacy was in dispute. This dynamic is visible in the way other historic sites have been preserved or repurposed. Consider how landmarks tied to democratic ideals, battlefields of the revolution, halls of civil rights victories, even humble homes of cultural pioneers, are embraced as shared heritage, precisely because they resonate with values that continue to unify. Frick's palace, by contrast, was a symbol of individual dominance, a statement about personal achievement rather than collective aspiration. When a society's values shift away from celebrating individual dominance toward questioning it, the monuments of the past must be contextualized rather than merely preserved. The palace's erasure, therefore, was not an act of oblivion, but of selective remembering, a recalibration of the historical story America chooses to tell, Yet there's another layer to this narrative. The interplay between private ambition and public space. Frick's estate existed at the intersection of the personal and the civic, private wealth and public perception. The palace was private property, a personal domain. Yet its architecture, collections, and social functions made it a public statement. The tension between private ownership and public symbolism meant that the palace was always larger than its walls. It was a touchstone for how Americans conceptualized wealth, taste, and authority. As those concepts evolved, the palace found itself out of sync with the broader cultural current. Its disappearance reminds us that public memory is not simply about structures, but about whether those structures continue to reflect collective values. Frick's legacy, like the palace that sought to immortalize him, became contested terrain. The Frick collection in New York, for example, endured because it was reframed as a cultural institution, divorced from the exclusivity and personal dominance implicit in the palace. There, Frick's art could be appreciated without celebrating personal authority in its unvarnished form. The palace, however, resisted such a reframing. Its very design was tied to the personal narrative of power. Without a reinterpretive framework that could reconcile that narrative with changing social values, the estate was left to fade. This phenomenon raises crucial questions about architecture, memory, and morality. What do we choose to preserve, and why? What does it mean to remember a past that is uncomfortable, ambiguous, or morally contentious? The Forgotten Palace challenges the assumption that all grand architecture deserves preservation. Instead, it suggests that preservation is as much a moral decision as it is aesthetic or historical. A building's survival depends not only on its craftsmanship, but on whether its meaning can adapt to new contexts, new interpretations, new generations. In the silence of the palace's absence, we are confronted not with loss alone, but with transformation. The story of Frick's Forgotten Palace is a mirror of America's own evolving identity. From a nation enamored with the spectacle of wealth, to one increasingly attentive to questions of fairness, representation, and shared narrative. It is a reminder that power, even when inscribed in stone, is never permanent. Influence may shape cities, industries, and culture, but its greatest test is not how loudly it announces itself, but whether it remains relevant in the collective memory of those who come after. The Forgotten Palace, therefore, speaks not of erasure but of historical negotiation. Its absence is not emptiness. It is a space filled with questions about how societies honor the past, confront ambivalence, and define themselves through selective remembering. In the ruins of its memory, we find the contours of a richer story, one that acknowledges not just the brilliance of individual achievement, but the complexities, contradictions, and evolving values of a nation that continues to wrestle with its own history. As we reflect on the palace that once stood and the silence that remains, we recognize that architecture can be both a monument and a mirror, reflecting not only the ambition of its creator but the changing face of the society that inherits it. The Forgotten Palace of Henry Clay Frick endures not in stone, but in the conversations, questions, and interpretations it provokes. In its absence, we see not a void, but a space for reflection, critique, and ongoing dialogue about the nature of memory, legacy, and the forces that shape collective understanding. In this sense, the Forgotten Palace still speaks, not as a monument to permanence, but as a testament to the ever-evolving story of who we are, what we value, and how we choose to remember.